Okay, so we'll keep letting folks pop in, and feel free to continue throwing your responses in the chat about best tips to keep your wildlife out of the field or with produce. I like this. Live traps, marigolds around the perimeter. Human hair deters rabbits. Fascinating. Love it. Thank you for that. Welcome everyone to session 4. You made it. You're what, like 6 weeks in now? We're really proud of you for making it this far, and you're keeping up with all of your homework assignments, hopefully. And if not, you've got something in the works in the back end. We know that you're working on it, so thank you. We're really excited to kick things off. We'll have Brett do sort of a recap and kind of check in with folks on homework that they had worked on from last time about buyer connections. And then we are going to give Annalisa the floor today to talk about food safety. And we're really excited. She's got lots of great content for that. We'll have some polls in there, some breakout rooms. You'll have a chance to talk to each other about your own experiences with that. And I think that's all I've got. I don't have a lot of check-in stuff this morning regarding tech. I think most people have really figured that stuff out at this point. It's mostly just being able to ask questions of our trainers. Don't hesitate to do that, right? Don't hesitate to just dig into the homework so that you have those questions early on instead of last minute. But yeah, I think that's all I've got on tech stuff. So I'm just going to hand it over to Brett if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Stephen, I have never had a single rabbit on my head, so I think you must be onto something. I hadn't heard that, but great. I was reviewing some of the homework you guys sent in. It's great. On the pitch kit, I think it number one, it was really, for me, really interesting to hear all of your stories. And I hope that what it did was kind of help you focus yourself and understand the who, why, and what you're doing. Sometimes you know it and you feel it, but once you sit down to like type it out, you get a better understanding and you start to feel more comfortable with your story. And some of you included great photos and great images of your farm and things like that. And I think that'll go a long way. And it's always going to really depend on the individual buyer, on like what you present to them. But once you start to put that together, you feel like you got something and it's not just quite so cold of a call. The channels and outlets also, it was great to see some people really digging, turning over rocks and trying to find maybe the spot that isn't so obvious, and really excited about that. I noticed a few didn't have the contact information, and probably have some tips for you on how to figure out the direct contacts and how to find out who that person is. I talked with one person and they did like a clever little call on the phone. Hey, who's the manager in charge of buying food, blah, blah, blah. And then said, oh, great, thanks. And then called back the next day and asked for that person. It seems a little silly, but it also might be a strategy, but we can talk about that later. One other thing that I'm going to do is we work closely with the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships at the University of Minnesota, and they have a rural grocery store project. And they have a fairly good list of rural grocery stores who have said that they would like to include local food in their retail stores. So I'm going to go through that list with them and find out which ones are in proximity to this group. And I will provide that contact if it wasn't already in your list. So these are people that have already reached out through the university to say they'd like to include local food. So we'll get that to those that are within a reasonable proximity. So that should be good. calendar options. I didn't make that a homework assignment, but it is something that I want to make sure that's on your radar, and we're going to do a little breakout session where we can discuss some of the hiccups, some questions you had, some things that you felt were barriers to get your homework done, things that you didn't quite understand or you could use some help with, and also discuss with each other like what kind of scheduling you plan on using, what kind of calendar or running notes, or how you're going to manage that outreach, which I'm sure some of you have done. I got some notes about, well, I already have these wholesale accounts. Perfect. I think that one thing that we've learned along the way from Ryan and Natalie and myself is that constant contact is good. Don't let those relationships get stale. So we're going to work on making sure that we have a calendar to keep in touch. Dan just asked, was the pitch kit part of the homework? Yeah, I think that was one of the, it was just a bunch of prompts on the who, why, and what your farm is. And I think that's in the folder, and we can resend that to you, Dan, if you need that. Natalie, do you want to pop everybody off into a breakout room, and we'll all discuss with one of our presenters what some of those barriers were, and then we can come back and see if we've got solutions within our own group after that. Well, that was quick. And I wonder if any of our presenters have any questions that I can jot down so that I have some idea of what people are needing and what I can help with.
I don't think anybody was stuck in our group, Brett. I mean, it's just a matter of people were feeling good. They had some contacts. They were getting some materials together. They may not be finalized, but just need to kind of like little pieces of things that need to get put together, essentially. So no, I think we were feeling good, right, team?
Right.
Okay, there we go.
I heard that there were some people struggling with the pitch kit, that was challenging to put together, and like people got started and were feeling really good about having gotten started, but probably needing to do some more to like expand their buyer contacts and put more pieces together. So I think the coaching will be a good idea.
We had some conversations about the kind of the depths of how much to include. Somebody brought up that they would include their irrigation and farm maps and kind of those type, their irrigation plans and capacity. And we had some conversation around, it would be probably good to assure your buyer that you are able to supply the correct quantity and quality, and irrigation is part of that. But maybe the buyer doesn't have to know all the nitty gritty, but just kind of like where that line is about how much to include, I think was potentially a question.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I feel like we were just getting started in our conversation. But it sounded like people were kind of on the right track. It sounded like a nice example of a one-pager with pictures and just kind of a quick overview and prices.
Yeah.
But I think, could we just open it up, and if people do have questions, people could just ask directly. I don't think we got that far in our group.
Yeah, go ahead. Feel free to unmute yourself and fire away. Except for Dan, who has the lead. He's not allowed to fire.
I've got a question about, I don't want to step on our local food hub's toes. So I don't, I don't know, maybe this isn't anything that can be answered, but, is there plans for the food hub to make some of these contacts as well? And, like, should I be, I don't want to, take my sales away from them, because if they're going to be selling, I'd much rather have them do it for me.
Yeah. So yeah, some of you are in fairly good proximity to a food hub. The farmers market food hubs specifically, I think is what Eric's talking about. And that's going to be, it is a convenience at a certain point for farmers to use that service if you're near one. And I would encourage that, but there's also going to be some of those potential customers who don't want to use it, and they want to have that really very direct connection, and they're gonna desire that. So you're gonna have to feel that out. If you are in proximity to a hub, I would definitely recommend that. It sort of expands your perceived value to them, because you're bringing more product to the market than you may be able to produce yourself. That's going to be an individual by individual basis, I would guess. Does that answer your question, Eric?
I guess so. And I could probably just reach out to my food hub managers and say, hey, where are you selling this year? I don't want to double call anybody. So
it's a good idea.
Yeah, well, and also if there are farmers like in the Aiken area where you're at, Eric, there are several farmers in this training who are in that general area. If you kind of put your pitches together, those could be run through the hub too. Like if the hub is making the contacts with buyers and has all of the farmers' pitches in hand to show, look, here are awesome farmers that are supplying the hub, that could also be valuable.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think that's one of the baked in advantages to this kind of the farmers market food hub, is that we really are intentional on keeping the farmer with the food, at least to the buyer, so that there's that connection is really strong. We don't want to lose that. So any other questions?
I have one. I'm curious if there might be some tools that you would suggest about going through the process of coming up with a name for my farm. I mean, like way at the beginning of this process.
That's a great question. Naming farms is one of those really that's a hard one, harder than naming my kids. Just a personal note, we live on 40 acres and have had sheep and some hens, and my little sister started an herbal tea garden before she moved to Hawaii, and we've tried to come up with a name for the farm, and it's impossible. Did anybody have any we did try Peekaboo Island for a while, because we're on the river and there's this little island, and depending on how much water is in the river, either the little island pops up or it's underneath. But so anybody have any good stories on how they came up with their farm names, or what the process was?
Jay always jokes that farm names, are run through a computer program system, and all you have to do is have some sort of biological component and then some sort of earth component. So Maple Ridge or Willow Sedge or Rock Meadow, like so. We always joke about that, but it's hard to do. My farm came with the name, so it was easy.
I put a generator in the chat, so that should solve the problem.
Yes, AI named farms. That's a concept. Yeah, I joked with my wife that I didn't want any like new age like labyrinth meditation circle fairy dust name. That I didn't want that. I wanted Vintergard, which is winter farm in Swedish. She said that sounded like scary, like you were going to get axe murdered in some kind of Viking TV show. And I'm like, all right, somewhere between Peekaboo Island and Murder Farm, I guess, is probably where we'll end up.
I know we had a process, just our own experience. I mean, we were just going through LSP's CSA list of farms. It's the biggest compiled list of farms at the time, 20 years ago. And you just see groupings of types of farms. Some are geographic, some are, I'm saying the kind of creative named ones. And, and so after we did that grouping, we just sort of strategically kind of thought like what makes most sense for us. We went with a geographic name. Lida Farm is a place, and for us that we were interested in really marketing very locally, that idea of having a place-based name seemed to make sense. We weren't really interested in selling to central North Dakota or the cities or anything. So and it's also next to a lake, so it's very it's in a place, and that seemed important to us. So I think once you get a sense of the groupings, you're kind of like, well, what do we want to be all about, and kind of go from there. I think that's my own take.
It's great.
Did you say the name of the data of all the listings of farms was called again? That you looked at the groupings of?
Oh, and this was 20 years ago. I mean, you could go on Minnesota Grown nowadays and get a nice list of a whole bunch of farms. But I think it is nice to get a big list. At the time, there was LSP's CSA directory, and that was a nice compiled list of farms across the state. And that kind of just helped us make those groupings, I guess.
Okay, thank you very much.
And if your great grandmother has a great name, like Astrid or something, that's always an option. But those are great. So here's I'm gonna hop off because we are gonna talk with Annalisa here in a little bit. But I want to let you know I'm going to be developing a calendar and sending it out through Emily to all of you for some time slots in which we can go through your channels and outlets or your pitch kit or both. And I can do some individual review and answer specific questions. And how do I do this? And if I want to do schools and they like to have a picture of a farmer, what kind of format am I going to need to do have on hand for them? That sort of stuff. I can do that. I'm going to create that. We have a program that we've used before for little time slots, and you'll be able to sign up for those. And I'm jetting off to a massive food show in California to promote American functional fruits, permaculture fruits at Expo West. So I'm not going to be with you for the rest of today, but maybe on the airplane, I can get that calendar put together and get it to Natalie and off to y'all. And you can feel free to sign up, and we can brainstorm farm names. I don't, whatever you want to do. But great work, you
Off
guys.
to Emily, Brett.
Off to
You
Emily.
keep putting Natalie to work. But
Oh, I'm sorry. Natalie, like you needed something else to do. Emily, I meant Emily. All right. Great work, guys. I really did appreciate all of the homework, and if you haven't got it completed yet, do that, and we'll keep moving forward. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank
See
you,
you-
Brett. Safe
See you
travels.
later. Yep. Bye-bye.
You know, it could be that we both have brown hair and our names have 3 syllables, you know?
I don't know.
Okay,
I'll
I think Annalisa, you're good to go.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi, everybody. So my name is Annalisa. I'm an extension educator in food safety at the university, work statewide. Just like Natalie, I work with Natalie on the same team. And my program focuses on food safety, on-farm food safety with fruit and vegetable farmers. So I know that most of us are doing produce. I know that some of us are doing other items, but the topics that we will talk about today pertain to fresh fruits and vegetables. So some goals here. This is going to be relatively fast and furious here. We do have some polls and some time for us all to kind of put our questions and thoughts in the chat and via polls, but do know that you might have questions after today, and I am available to answer those questions. But we probably aren't going to go into depth on all of the topic areas. So it's a bit of a survey. So we're going to really kind of like walk through the different aspects of fruit and vegetable production, and then think about relative risks in each one of those areas of production. And then we'll think about how gaps can reduce those risks. So that's really like the nut of what we're talking about today. Hopefully maybe put on that food safety lens so we can identify, oh, there's maybe some risks that I hadn't thought about previously, but I am now aware of them, and I am now aware of some gaps that can reduce them. Then, because this is about wholesale readiness, we're going to be thinking about how to start that food safety plan, and the beginning of which will be your homework. We'll talk about well water. That's another thing that you can provide to a customer to show that you are assessing and reducing risks around water. I guarantee you're already doing a number of things very well. I know many of you have been to trainings. I know that many of you have been in production for a long time, and you're probably doing a lot of things right. So you can kind of assure yourself that you're doing those things right. There might be some areas where you can make improvements. And then just kind of identifying some further information, some more resources around some of those areas where you have continuing questions. So this is not, we're not going to talk about all of these things in depth. Do not worry, you will get out before 5 p.m. Gaps. Someone write in the chat what this acronym stands for. All right, Eric got it first. Virtual candy coming to Eric. So our goal here is to really keep the poop from humans and animals off the field. We're focusing on microbial contamination. We're not focusing on chemical or physical hazards, although those are not great. It's not great to have nails or glass in your salad mix when your customer is opening it, or a pen that fell out of your shirt. But the microbial risks are almost tougher to deal with because we can't see them. We're talking about microscopic organisms, and therefore they can do a lot of risk at a larger scale, and it's difficult because we can't see them. So again, we're talking about minimizing risk. We're not talking about eliminating it in each area. Every time we work with fresh produce, we can take actions to minimize that risk. We're never sterilizing. We're never completely eliminating that risk. We're growing outside. There's animals, there's people, there's lots of variables. But the good thing is these are really scientifically proven to reduce the risk. So our first poll, Emily will launch. I know that I have seen many of you in trainings. So if you can answer that, let us know if you are having difficulty finding how to do that. Looks like many of you are getting it. All right. I think we can end that poll. 10 out of 14 say that they have attended a GAPS training or a FSMA training. So good. We have a lot of expertise in the room already. So just to be clear, make sure we're all on the same page. Our customers, our wholesalers are definitely going to wash the produce before they eat it. Folks at the farmers market are going to eat their produce before they eat it. So if it's washed, wouldn't this contamination just get off? And the answer is no. So we're talking about microbiological and microscopic organisms here. So we have a stomata on a leaf lettuce. We have some E. coli on it. They're so small that the folds in that lettuce is enough to protect them. That's like a mountain compared to these tiny little organisms, and they can be very well protected, and they can grow in post-harvest if given the right conditions, exponentially even, and cause rot in your produce and cause potentially human illness if they're pathogenic strains. Same with the bumpy rind on a muskmelon there. So the reality is, depending on that initial load of pathogens, it's not possible to wash it off in post-harvest. So our goal isn't to wash it off in post-harvest, is to keep it off in the first place. A lot of this produce is getting eaten raw. If you were selling this produce to a processor, you would probably not take this course, because that product is going through a kill step. It's treated as a commodity. It's a completely different set of practices. If I'm going to be eating, or a child or an elderly person or a sick person is going to be eating this lettuce raw, very small amount, 10 cells of pathogenic E. coli to make you quite ill, potentially leading even to hospitalization or long-term issues. It can cause long-term kidney issues, these kind of things that we really don't want. So why we're talking about this is we, of course, want to provide safe food to our customers. We want to protect the local food system. If we had an outbreak traced back to a farm to school program, to a school garden, to someone selling to a food hub, it's possible that that would not be good for the local food system. Unfortunately, people kind of paint with a broad brush and they say, oh my gosh, I believe that those farmers markets, for example, or all those farm to school programs, I don't know about them. I'm not sure they're safe. And then those sales might decrease for everybody. So kind of like we're all in this together. And if we all do these basic practices, we kind of protect us all. Of course, having adequate insurance is your best protection for liability. At the same time, using good agricultural practices and keeping some basic records can also reduce your liability. So if there was a concern and someone said, I'm pretty sure I got sick from eating your lettuce, you can say, I'm not sure if you did or not, but I have good practices. I attended a training and I have basic records to show that I kept those, that I did those things. That's going to go a long way to reduce your own liability. Remember, we're not eliminating, but we are reducing risk. If you said, nah, I don't really care about that food safety stuff, I don't have any records, that's, you haven't protected yourself in that instance. And generally a court isn't going to find in your favor because you haven't done what they would deem a reasonable farmer to do. So gaps are what a reasonable farmer would do. There might be regulatory implications. We will talk through those very briefly. You might need it for market access, either through a gap audit or just by having a food safety plan. We shall start here. But to be clear, it really does apply to all farms, regardless of size. You are not allowed to sell adulterated product. You are not allowed, it really applies to anybody who's selling to others to eat. It also can improve the shelf life and quality. So clearly quality is a primary goal, especially when we're selling to wholesale, right? They need that kind of consistent quality. So the good thing is these practices in food safety that we do to keep the produce clean, to keep our post-harvest environment clean, our totes are clean, we're reducing the number of potential bacteria that are there that are going to also be spoilage microorganisms that will cause rot, that will cause our lettuce to turn to slime. So it will last longer on our customer shelf. They're more likely to come back to us. So the beauty is we don't have to create this whole other set of practices, like you need one more thing to manage, right? This goes hand in hand. You've got good food safety, you also have good quality. So that efficiency, that comes with having some basic standard operating procedures about how you set up your wash line and how you take it down and how you clean it. That's good for food safety. It's also just good for efficiency and having kind of a nice place for your workers to work. I always train with farmers when we do our trainings, and a lot of our farmer trainers like to say, I initially thought that my employees were going to be like, oh, great, one more thing I have to manage. When they implemented just some basic, food safety plan on their farm, their employees, they said, we're so happy. They said, oh, thank you. It's more efficient. It's more organized. I know where stuff is going to be at the end of the day. So another poll question here. Here we have the outbreaks associated with produce. So why do we think that leafy greens and melons and tomatoes and berries and herbs are more likely to cause that foodborne illness as opposed to other things that aren't on this list? I'm getting you to think about the actual qualities of the product itself, the physiology of the produce. More surface area, a shorter shelf life, could be, yeah. Something else about these products. Lots of crevices, lots of shelf life, lots of bumps, and they are eaten raw, exactly. And many of them do touch the soil directly, yes. So all of these are risk factors, increasing their risk. Now, you absolutely, many of you grow these things, and that's okay. But I'm getting your mind to kind of prioritize food safety when you're growing things that will be consumed raw, especially, and have lots of surface area, making them even more difficult to clean, to wash. Berries are almost always harvested by hand as well. So if we've got human viruses that are spread from sick humans, like norovirus or hepatitis A, these are not spread by animals, these are spread by humans. They're coming in from sick workers, and hands touch berries, and they're always eaten raw, right? I'm eating them before I leave the farmer's market probably. So, but to be clear, you should tell your customers to wash everything they take home. Okay, these are the type of categories of microorganisms that we're talking about. So these are bacteria, viruses, and parasites. So can someone tell me an example of a difference? I know that 10 of 14 of you said that you've been to a GAPS training before. Tell me a difference between a bacteria and a virus. Something about the biology of those organisms. Bacteria and viruses are basically what we're talking about. Parasites can also be a risk. Parasites are often in contaminated water. Bacteria is from humans and animals' poops. Viruses don't have DNA and they need a host. They do. So viruses can't replicate outside of that host. So if they're outside of their human host, they will be stable in the environment, but they won't replicate. They won't grow. Bacteria, on the other hand, if given the right conditions, will grow, and they will grow fast. So that's why we're refrigerating our meat after we cook it. And that's why we are refrigerating our produce as quickly as we can as well. And that's why we're keeping our post-harvest environment clean, because if there was some bacteria on that muskmelon and it was sitting, as this slide shows, in, let's say, 85 degrees, they're optimized, or even more, they're optimized for the temperature of our guts and butts, they say. So those bacteria do well in us. So if it's hot in your pack shed and it's dirty, and there was some poop that came in on a really dirty tote, and it got put right on a table, and it sat there, and it was warm, and there was wet because it was a packing area. We have a few cells, and we now have a lot of cells because of exponential growth. So that's why, and the good thing is basic cleaning really does well to kill bacteria and some sanitizing, and to really get rid of those conditions by which they thrive. So just another note on prevention, and we have had outbreaks. Wisconsin, I grew up there, I can call out Wisconsin, eastern Wisconsin, 15 people sickened at least in a couple of different outbreaks they had associated with salmonella on peas that they brought into the they brought into their washing area. They washed the peas. The peas had a lot of bird poop on them. They hadn't thought through how to reduce risks around wildlife. Geese happen, but you don't pull in the poop covered peas. They did. The water turns out just spreads it around. It doesn't get rid of it. It spreads it around. A bunch of people were sick and 3 people were sent to the hospital. Actually, it was not good for those farmers markets. So, and there were a lot of other factors that went into play there, but in general, those folks weren't using good agricultural practices. So that's why it's best to learn about this and use it, because it really protects us all. And then the other larger national outbreaks that we won't have to get into now, but they have happened. So to be clear, since we're talking about wholesale sales, can schools and hospitals and others buy directly from farmers under the Minnesota law? Jane will be talking about this next time in more depth, but to be clear, yes, you do not need a license to sell product of your own farm. They're exempt from licensing as long as the product that you're selling to them was fully grown by your farm. You're also not required to have a GAP audit, but a buyer can require it. I'm moving super quickly. Let me know if there's questions. I'm going to give you an overview of GAP audits. So to be clear, sometimes people kind of get the terms mixed up, so I'll try to clarify it. GAPs are things we do, not a law. They're science-based principles we apply while we're growing stuff. Then the FSMA rule, for the first time, mandates some of these practices, and this was a law that was passed by the federal government. And then a GAP audit has been around for many years. Sorry, my thing keeps on messing up. It's bothering me. And this is not, this is optional. This is not a law. And this is a thing that you can do to get into a market that requires it, if you want to, but you don't have to. So a GAP audit is voluntary. It's something that you set up with the Minnesota Department of Agriculture or other auditing services ahead of time. You pay for this service. It is going to be $500, $1,000, something like that annually. There is a cost share in Minnesota up to 75% for 3 years to pay for the cost of that audit. It is conducted by crop. So your lettuce or your tomato or your green onions gets the audit. But they can do many at once. So it's not as if they're coming back 3 different times. So they go down a checklist that is completely available to you ahead of time. They say, yes, they are doing this, they're doing this. And I'm observing, but more importantly, I'm reviewing their records. It's really a records review. So you have to have roughly a season's worth of records to show that auditor. And then you pay, and then you pass the audit, and then you have something to show your buyer. So some buyer, why would you do this? Because some buyers require it. If you're going to sell to Bix, if you're going to sell to Cisco, out the gate, one of the very first questions they're going to ask is, do you have a third-party GAP audit? If you say no, you likely will not get to sell to them. If you say yes, then you have to give them that certificate. Most food hubs in Minnesota that I am aware of do not require a GAP audit, but I would really encourage you through this process to learn about, kind of basically get to the point where you could get an audit, learn about the practices, write a food safety plan, and keep some basic records. Then if you need to sell to somebody who requires that audit, you'll be able to. This is an example of what that certificate looks like. Again, it's annual. So you would need to redo that every year that you seek that audit. Okay, poll number 2. Do you have a GAP audit on any of your produce? Yes, no, wouldn't do that, possibly, I don't know. All right, we got quite a few possibly. Okay. So 10 out of 14 said possibly in the future. Yep. And so I would suggest that you just keep on learning about it and keep some basic records so that if you do need to kind of move, let's say kind of quickly, pivot some of your product. Let's say you just have a lot of squash. Gosh, you're doing so well in summer squash or winter squash or anything. The audit, if you're going to sell the BICs, they're not going to say we only need it on high risk commodities. They just need it on anything coming in the door, because those products are often going to be commingled in their warehouse, or at least the boxes might be stacked on each other. So they just want good practices across the board. So if you want to sell a bunch of your squash to BICs, it's really good to have to basically be ready. So everyone does gaps. Before you pay for the audit, though, make sure it's a good financial decision for you. There's a lot of different kind of ways to determine if it's the best financial decision, but I've heard people throw out something like maybe $2,000 would be a threshold, $2,000 worth of product that you're selling in that commodity to a buyer who requires it before you get that gap audit, because you're paying for the gap audit. So it definitely is a financial decision. Remember, do the practices, but then to take that next step would be a financial decision. And I can absolutely help you think that through. There aren't that many vegetable farms in Minnesota that have it. There's a roughly 15, actually probably fewer, diversified veg operations that have a gap audit. There are potato and apple growers beyond that as well, putting our total to maybe 40 or so. But in our state, we do so much direct to consumer sales, it isn't the norm. In other states, it absolutely is the norm. So if you want to do it, don't be afraid, but know that it takes time to develop your records, and you do have to pay for it. If you don't want to get a gap audit, you think it's just not financially a good decision, you can assure your buyer that you use good food safety practices, but you doing these following things. So your basic food safety plan that you're going to write as a part of this, you can expand it and really include kind of all of your policies around food safety. You can provide them a water test. Say, yes, I use well water. Yes, we test it annually for the presence of generic E. coli. It's good to go. It's potable water. Really just talking with them. And really, I'm hoping one thing you can get out of this is that you become familiar with the vocabulary to talk about food safety, because some people don't have that yet. And so these are the kind of topics that you might want to talk to them about: employee health and hygiene, water testing, soil amendments, kind of what you use for manure, and then how you wash and pack your produce. Will it be washed? Will it not? And then, of course, that gets into the packaging and the kind of post-harvest things. So you absolutely can use good food safety and show it without a gap audit. But if you want to move towards that gap audit because your buyer requires it, we'll help. You can also have them do a farm visit if that's amenable to both of you. Okay, moving on. Fast and furious. The FSMA, food safety. I was going to ask you to put in what FSMA stands for, but it says right in the middle of the slide. Food Safety Modernization Act. The produce safety rule is one of 7 different rules under the produce safety rule, or under the FSMA Food Safety Modernization Act. So it is the one that pertains to the growing and harvesting and holding of fruits and vegetables. So FSMA was signed in 2011, enacted about 2016. And for the first time, it kind of mandated a baseline use of good agricultural practices on farms. Many of you might know your status under the rule, but some of you might not. So I'm going to go through it real quick. There's a lot of exemptions to this rule. And this is kind of how it can suss out. But we can help you figure out your status if you don't know after this in kind of a one-on-one, because it can get sticky with different business entities and how things are set up. You can be excluded, you can be exempt from most of it, or you can be fully covered. So those are kind of like the terms that we use. You are excluded if you sell less than roughly $28,000 in produce, and that's averaged annually using the previous 3 years' sales. So that excludes quite a few people. So that's number one. If you say, yeah, I don't grow more than that, then you don't have to answer any more questions. You won't be subject to the rule. You won't get an inspection. You still have to use good agricultural practices, but you won't get the inspection. If you grow things only that you eat, if you grow things that are only on this list of 34 items that the federal government says are rarely consumed raw, like winter squash and sweet corn, and I'll provide the list. But if you only grew those things, you also would be excluded. Or if everything was going to processing, you also would be excluded. You can be qualified exempt. So this is the middle category. Let's say you grew more than the $28,000, or you sold more than the $28,000. The next question is, where does it go? if more than 50% of that food that you're growing is going directly to a qualified end user, which is like a farmer's market or a grocery store that's in the same state or 275 miles away, a CSA, if it's going direct to the consumer, you are exempt from most of this rule as well. You have to do a little bit of labeling and just show folks what your address is on either on your package or at your farm stand or via an email. So again, if more than 50% went to something like on-farm sales, CSA, farmers markets, grocery stores, you're exempt from most of it. But if more than 50% goes to a wholesaler, a food hub, a distributor, a Bix, you're covered. That means you have to comply with the rule. It's a weird way to say it, but you have to comply with the rule. So you will have an inspection from the Department of Agriculture. It is set up ahead of time and they come out and they do an inspection, and it's very similar to a gap audit. They just go down a list of things, and you do have to send someone to a FSMA training. So if more than 50% of your sales go to that wholesaler, if you're moving more wholesale, I bring this up because it's important to know that you might have implications for your coverage under the FSMA rule. To be clear, it is not bad to have to be subject to inspection. If I were you and I was in this category, if I was selling $40,000 worth of produce and more than 50% of it was going to a food hub, I'd be covered. I would say, well, I'm going to have to keep some records. I'm going to have this inspector out once a year. So it might even be once every 2 years. But then I can also provide that to my customer. It's almost like a free gap audit. Your buyer might say, okay, I guess we don't need you to get a gap audit. You have this certificate that you had an inspection done. They might also require a gap audit. I can't guarantee that, but it's something. It's a verification step that was done on your farm. Okay. So if you do have to follow the FSMA, we offer these trainings. They're also offered in every state in the country because this is a federal law, and you could take it also elsewhere, but ours are good. And you should fill out an annual MDA grower questionnaire to document your status with the Department of Agriculture. Okay, third poll. So those dollar amounts are adjusted to inflation. So they were $25,000 to start, and they go up each year because they're indexed, they're attached to a 2011 dollar. Okay, we got a lot of people saying that they know. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end it. And excellent. Let us know if you need more help on that. Okay, now I'm going to go over some topics. Now think about these, how these pertain to each of for your farm, because this will be for your homework. You'll be kind of answering some basic questions around each of these topic areas. So first, we've got workers. So everyone, think about who is on your farm. It might be employees, but it might be volunteers. It might be your grandma. It might be your kid. It might be auntie. But everyone who's really touching the produce is a food handler, not unlike a restaurant. They're touching produce that might be consumed by a child or by someone, and it might not be washed. And remember, we can't wash off contamination. So everybody needs some sort of training. And we really want to do our best to ensure that the folks that are harvesting our produce aren't sick with some symptoms of gastrointestinal illness. Now, I say gastrointestinal illness because that's what is transferred via this fecal oral route. We're not talking about someone sneezing because they have allergies, because that's not going to be transferred on the produce to anyone. But if I had norovirus and I was throwing up, like my 13-year-old did this morning, threw up all over the house many times. So she is not in school because the bits of stuff that might be on her could transfer easily to someone else. So produce could be a vector for that. So we're wearing clean clothes, you know, of course, within reason. They're getting dirty during the day, but showing up generally clean. And we're not smoking while we're actually in the farm harvesting. You can go off to the side and do that, but while you're harvesting, the saliva, the potential for saliva transfer on your hands is too great. And don't be this guy smoking. And, you know, especially if he's around tomatoes, we don't want his tobacco in there, and we just don't want him smoking in the fields. He looked like he was fun to hang out with, though. So then we've got basic health and hygiene. So having a first aid kit available, keeping it stocked, keeping the, you know, basic Band-Aids full is important, and have a policy about what to do when there's an injury so everyone doesn't freak out, because injuries happen, and people should know that if blood was to get onto that produce is discarded. You clean up blood that's in the field, you bandage up the person. If you have a Band-Aid on, make sure to put a glove or a finger cut over that so the Band-Aids don't drop into the salad mix. Cell phones are everywhere. They're okay to have on the farm. Of course, we're using them over the day, but really try to minimize their use during harvest or washing. So thinking about those times when you're actually in contact with the produce and not harvesting lettuce, going out, texting, going right back in, because your phone is too much of a vector, and they're known to be, of course, as dirty as toilets in some instances. So that's why having field hand washing is really important. So hand washing is really the way that we break that fecal oral route. It is the best documented way. It's boring as heck, I know, but it is the way that it works. So when should we wash our hands? Here we don't have a poll. You can just go ahead and unmute. When do we wash our hands on the farm? Someone give me an example.
When starting new tasks.
Okay, when starting new tasks. Excellent. Somebody else.
After going to the bathroom.
Yes, number one, after using the bathroom. Very important.
Returning from lunch.
Returning from lunch. Excellent. Often we think about washing our hands before we eat, don't we? Well, who does that protect? That protects us. After eating protects our customer. Excellent. Before harvesting. So really think of it as like scrubbing in. You are going in to harvest, and you're kind of like, you've washed your hands and you're going to do your very best to keep them clean before you go ahead and touch that produce. Before putting on gloves, if you wear gloves for harvest, some of us do, that's just fine. You don't have to for food safety in any way in a production environment. Wear gloves. I know in a ready-to-eat environment, gloves are often mandated for anytime you're touching the food, but in our farm environment, absolutely not mandated. If you put them on, it's often for harvest. Maybe we're harvesting tomatoes or zucchinis or cucumbers or something, but make sure to wash hands well before you put them on. If you're out in the field and there's a big pile of poop, it's really handy to be able to wash our hands. So these are the things that a hand washing stand has. And here's an example of what it can look like. The one on the right has the flowing water. The one on the left does not. So that would be difficult to wash your hands well, I would think. And this is just an idea of a stand, and we'll send you a link to, build the stand, but you could build this completely differently or not use it at all. It does not need to be on here. It could be on a table, but you've got paper towels in that dishpan drawer, so that keeps them out of the rain a little bit. But again, nothing special about this. I've heard people say, oh, I build it so much better. It's like, excellent, go for it. I'm not a carpenter. We just designed that. So on the back of a truck there, that works real great. I've seen them in vans. I've seen them, because some of our fields are quite a distance from our home. So if your only hand washing is at the house and it's a 10-minute walk back or to even 3-minute drive back, are you really going to go back every time you need to? You might not. So it's nice to have it with you. Sanitizer, I think we know by now. Give me a thumbs up. Thumbs up. Is sanitizer okay to use instead of hand washing? Probably not. Nope. It's okay to use, in the car or something if our hands are clean, but kind of like, you can't sanitize a dirty surface. You wouldn't just put mouthwash on your dirty teeth. You'd wash them. So you have to physically remove with that soap and water. Have some sort of a bathroom. Side of the field is not your bathroom. That goes without saying. I know that you all know that, but we do just have to say it. And if you have volunteers and things, tell them too. Just remind them, say, yep, and we don't use the side of the fields. Go ahead and use these bathrooms. That's why we have them for you. Train your workers. These are some basic things. Your food safety plan becomes your training document. So it really helps to be able to say, hey, I don't remember all the things I'm supposed to train you on. So here you go. I got this food safety plan. But it's really going to focus on, you know, where the bathrooms and when to wash your hands, to not work when you're sick, your policies. I've worked with a ton of farms that have a very simple, you know, 5 or 6 different, just short little sentences on a page that they hand to volunteers, for example. Doesn't need to be a big, long training. Okay, next poll. Do you have hand washing available to your farm? Employees or workers or volunteers, whoever's out there helping you with harvest or washing chores. All right, we've got yes. A lot of saying yes, yes. Excellent, nice job. A couple of us saying we could use a bit more. Okay, moving on, water. Water is extremely important. We use it in a lot of different ways in the farm, but it can present a risk if it comes in contaminated or if it spreads around contamination that's already there. Remember the peas example, or there's lots of other examples. The listeria and salmonella was spread in part by water in that post-harvest. So now we're going to talk for a second about testing our irrigation water and really kind of thinking about using that water. So here we've got different sources of water. Dan, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. As an organic certified farm, you are required to test your water every 3 years. Is that satisfactory? What you're talking about?
Right. So it is a best practice for food safety. Organic doesn't always line up with food safety. They're not really thinking about human pathogens. It is a best practice to do it yearly, simply because a lot can happen in 3 years. A well can break. So I really would suggest yearly. If you were to get a gap audit, they would absolutely require it to be done annually.
Thank you.
So municipal water would be the lowest risk. It has been treated and by the city or the Rural Water Authority, whoever is treating that water, it meets drinking water standards. Groundwater is somewhere in the middle. It varies based on your well. And then surface water, I think it's pretty clear, would be kind of the highest risk. So for municipal water, you don't need to test it. Do know that kind of based on the line. So if your hose or your different irrigation lines that you had presented a risk, you might want to test still to see if your lines themselves were introducing contamination, but the water from the source is tested for you. Most of us are probably using groundwater or well water. So that really is medium risk, and it really depends on the well, and the quality of the well and the age of the well is probably one of the bigger factors. So just an annual inspection, making sure your well is functional, making sure that the wellhead has been properly capped. If it's been serviced, that they recapped it. Make sure that the grade is sloping away. So if there was any flood water coming from off farm, or from different sources on your farm, it wouldn't go down and go in. A backflow prevention device would just be that check valve to ensure that if there was water at the end of the line, if there's a line going out to a tank, for example, for livestock, it wouldn't be sucked back into the well, contaminating the well. Pretty standard hardware there. When I see issues with wells, it's that they're old, it's that they're shallow, or that they've been serviced recently and they haven't been been put back correctly. Maybe the cap is off, or just a minuscule crack happened during servicing. So that annual check of that testing is really what's going to help you understand that quality. Don't put your animals right around that wellhead. I have heard examples of growers getting some generic E. coli hits, for example, in their well test. And I said, well, what changed? And they said, well, I've been stacking my poultry litter right on top of the well or really close to it. Well, there you go. That's enough. Even with a deep well, that's enough. So do your best to keep them away. The surface water, is anyone using a surface water source like a stream or a lake or a pond in any irrigation? To be clear, you can do that. You could not use this water for post-harvest, but you can use it for irrigation purposes. It's not as common in Minnesota, but if you were, that'd be okay. And this is how you would reduce the risk. So if you were using drip, for example, see those nice pretty pictures of oranges, we've got drip tape and it's going down, probably going to reduce the risk substantially, right? Because it's not touching the harvestable portion of the produce. The overhead, we've got the spray on it. Obviously, if that was lettuce and I was going to eat that raw and they just sprayed river water all over it, that would be a risky practice and would not recommend that. And in other parts of the country, when they do that, they're often treating that water before they do that at great expense, I will say. Okay, we do have some use of pumpkins and winter squash. That would be another excellent way, Sheila, thank you, to reduce the risk. If you are using surface water, you could also apply it to things that are not going to be eaten raw. So your pumpkins and your winter squash can be irrigated with that water. Do know that in post-harvest, let's say you brought them in your pack shed, there could be some contamination on it from that water. So I would do my best to water multiple days before you bring it into the pack shed, just so you're not bringing that water in where it might be spread around. But that's another way. Yep. To either wait between application and harvest, apply with drip, or apply it on things that won't be eaten raw. So testing is recommended, like I said, annually. It really is the only way to understand that long-term quality. It's just data that you can use every year. And what we're testing for is that generic E. coli. It's an indicator organism of fecal contamination. So where there's E. coli, there's all these other things, salmonella, listeria, shigella. We're not testing for all of these other things, but when we test for E. coli, there's a stronger likelihood that these other things will be present because there's poop from animals or humans. So how often? Untreated surface water, at least 4 times throughout the growing season. So that would be those lakes or streams or ponds. Don't use that for washing the vegetables. If it's groundwater, once per season is generally adequate, although you might choose to do it a few times throughout the season to understand if there's seasonality, especially with a shallow well. So if you have a shallow well, it's going to be much more under the influence of surface water because a 20-foot well is it's much more likely to have contamination in it. So if I had a shallow kind of driven well, I would absolutely test it more frequently. And then the municipal water, no need to test. Questions on that? Okay, this is an example of how that report comes back. You see the coliform bacteria is less than 1 CFU. So that's less than 1, no detectable. That's what we're looking for. That means it's potable water. But remember, E. coli is a type of coliform bacteria. So when it says there's no coliform bacteria, there's no E. coli because E. coli is a subset. It's a type of coliform bacteria that indicates that fecal contamination. So the results, know that the results might just say no coliform bacteria. And so how to collect them? So we're gathering the sample. If it's from surface water, use a painter's pole or something, tape your collection device on the end, very carefully open that top with very clean hands, go in, take your sample a couple feet out from the shore, put your lid back on, put it on ice, get it to the lab within 24 hours. If it's from a hydrant, follow the instructions, which generally say, let it run for a few minutes, put it in under, don't let it overflow because it's got some material in there that needs to stay in there, that reagent. So just put it in there up to the line, put that lid on, again, really clean hands, get it back to that lab. It is generally about $35 for 1 E. coli test. You might add on other things that might add cost. But it is your time too. Our friends in the Northeast, unfortunately, don't have as many labs. I will say in other parts of the state, you likely are going to have quite a few more labs available to you. All right, poll number 5.
Annalisa, question
Mhm.
from Sal in the chat quick. Our water tests only say presence, absence of coliforms, not ppm. Is that acceptable?
Not the CFU. Yeah. So I suggest when you call your lab asking for a quantitative, so document how many CFU of E. coli are in my water. The reason being, if you just say presence or absence, and then there is some, you're going to have to retest. So at the same time, if yours says there no total coliform present, well, then you're good. Because there's the potential for it to be present, from the beginning, I would just start with saying, tell me how much E. coli is in my water, because then you won't have to redo it. So it just kind of saves that extra step in the event that there is any in there. But if you have no coliform in your water, you have potable water, no E. coli. So we have quite a few people using well water, and a few people with municipal water, and a couple of people with combination. Okay, I will also say collected water, like a rain barrel that's collected from the roof, would be considered that surface water because it's open to the environment and more likely to have contamination in it. We have a link to water lab testing, to labs, a site that has some of these labs listed. It can be a little bit difficult to talk to labs. They kind of speak lab sometimes. And so I would be happy to help you navigate that depending on the lab. Some of them, the bigger ones, do this all the time. It's not going to be a challenge. But when you call, say, I have agricultural water, I'm using it on my farm. It's not just drinking water, because if it's just drinking water, they're going to do that presence absence, because that's all drinking water can have. But you say, I use this on my farm. I use it for irrigation and I use it for washing. I want to know if there's E. coli in there, because that's what's required of me. And they'll say, okay. But if they don't, you can reach out and kind of ask for help, and we'll go to bat for you. Manure and compost. All right, so now we're kind of getting into some of the soil amendments and the things that we use during the actual growing. And there are a lot of different types of soil amendments and compost, and they really vary based on their type. So again, we're going to kind of identify those risks and ways to reduce them. So the types really will say how risky they are. There are a lot of benefits of using manure. We're not in no way saying that you cannot use manure. Absolutely. We are saying it is acceptable to use. But if we're in other parts talking about a small amount of poop, here we might be talking about a large amount of poop, literally maybe piles of poop. So we have to take care when we're using that to do it safely. So if your soil amendments, we're kind of going to categorize them real briefly here. If their soil amendments are from plants like yard waste, from your pack shed or green manure, or a pre-consumer, so that's like stuff that hasn't been on a plate yet, it's just kind of scraps from when you were cooking. If it's just vegetative, it's going to be very low risk, because remember, we're thinking about poop from animals and humans as carrying those human pathogens, so pretty low likelihood of poop being in there. Now, if you're in Jane's yard and she has 10 goats in her yard, she might have more poop in her yard clippings than someone who has no animals. Something to consider. Generally pretty low risk. And you can use that without restriction for soil amendment if you like. So then if it's from animals, then we're getting into a higher risk category. Again, you can still use that, but now it kind of depends if it's been treated or not. If it's raw, so if it's a raw manure product, that would fall into a higher risk category. But here are some animal-based soil amendments: bone meal, feather meal, fishimals, and these kind of things. So you can use these things again, but how you use it depends on if it's been treated or not. If it's been fully treated, if it's a bag of that bone meal, if it's a stain, if it's something that was gone through a scientifically validated treatment process, you can use it without restriction. So that's going to be, you can apply it in the spring, because the pathogen load has been drastically reduced through that scientifically validated treatment process. This category would not include a pile of just kind of passively aged manure that sat there for a year or 2 or 5. because it didn't heat up thoroughly and completely and consistently throughout that pile. So this aged stacked manure that just kind of sat there, somebody cleaned out their barn for you and just gave it to you. You can use this, to be clear. I'm not saying you can't use these untreated products, but they would be the highest risk product because they haven't gone through that treatment process to reduce the pathogens. So if you're using those untreated, you would just wait 90 days between application and harvest for plants that don't have any soil contact, like a trellis tomato, 120 days if that cucumber would be untrellised on the ground, or that melon would be on the ground. So that often means incorporating in the fall. Your treated products, again, doesn't have that wait time. It's not considered zero risk. It was still potentially poop from an animal or another byproduct from an animal. So it's not considered zero. Still do your best to keep it off that harvestable portion, but it's been treated so the pathogen load is very low. Some other things to consider if you're using that manure. So see that top pile there. What are some risks there that you see? Can people see what that is? So let's say my neighbor brought over that nice pile of manure from their barns and said, would you like to use this in your vegetables? And you said, sure. I did my soil test, because remember, we also have lots of other considerations about when and how to use manure. We don't just want to put it on. We want to make sure our soil actually needs it and we're not getting too much phosphorus and things. But if we decide that it would be a good product to use, the risks are, yes, runoff. So think about the pathways. Remember, to be a risk, the poop has to actually get onto the food. It's not just a risk if it's a half a mile away and really doesn't have a way to get on it. Then it's just a hazard sitting there. It's not a risk until it gets on it. So it could be runoff. Tell me another way it could get on there. Wind, excellent. Yes, wind. So the top of that pile might dry out, right? Depending on conditions. If it was hot and sunny and dry, that wind is going to carry those particles. One other way that might get in there.
Yeah, Russell Kleinschmidt just put in the chat, transport from animals or people traffic.
Yes, exactly. So we've got people walking through there. They're walking through their boots and there's rivulets of runoff and they're going into the pasture or they're going into the fields. Animals definitely play in compost, don't they? And I will also say machinery. So you're driving through there. Think about, am I now going to go drive into the pack shed and I just went through a pile of manure? So anytime you are kind of integrating either animals themselves or their fecal material into your operation, that's okay, but you really need to think through how you're going to reduce those risks. So separating it in the bottom picture, we've got some finished compost. Now this person perhaps made their own, they followed the guidelines, these documented, these are from the National Organic Program, guidelines on how to make a finished compost from raw, and it involves turning and taking the temperature and keeping records, and it is now a finished product with a low pathogen load. And that is like gold. We want to keep that separate from the raw stuff because we don't have to use a time delay with this stuff, right? Or if we bought it, it's not cheap. So let's protect it. Let's keep a barrier under it. Let's keep plastic over it so that it doesn't get recontaminated. Okay, last thing on this module, and then I think we'll take a break. Rank the following, and you can do this in the chat. I'll give you a minute. So don't use a comma to separate them. So don't hit 1 and then hit enter. Write 3 things separated by commas in the chat. Carrot tops. You can just write carrot tops. You don't have to write the whole thing. Manure and heat treated poultry manure. So you've got 3 things. Put the highest risk things first and the lowest risk thing last. All right. Excellent. I'm seeing a lot of correct answers, which would be the raw manure would be the most risky. Then I'm seeing a little bit of discrepancies. So would the second be the heat treated poultry manure, which it's gone through the scientifically validated treatment process to reduce the pathogens, or would the middle be the carrot tops? I'm mostly seeing carrots at the end, which would be the correct answer. So the carrots would be the lowest. Remember, the first question is it purely from plants? If it's just from plants, it's automatically in a lower risk category. Even though that poultry manure has gone through that validated treatment process, those are not perfect, and it still was initially poop. So your risk of pathogenic organisms being in that is definitely higher than in those carrot tops, unless there was some reason for your carrot tops to have a ton of poop in it or something. When it's purely vegetative, it's automatically really lower. So the animal would be in the higher risk, but the poultry would definitely be lower than that raw manure. So we have to kind of think through a couple of different things there, but you guys did really well. Excellent. Questions on anything I shared so quickly before we take a break?
Annalisa, I've got a number of clients that are strawberry farmers, and they're using surface water in the spring to help with frost protection. So berries aren't going to come on for another, at least probably 3-4 weeks. What kind of risks are they putting themselves at?
Are the flowers present?
Mm-hmm.
Technically, there is some evidence to show that the flowers themselves can take up pathogens, and then it becomes the fruit, which then could be contaminated. So there is some risk there. If they were covered by the FSMA produce safety rule, they would have to follow those guidelines, which mean doing the risk assessment and testing that surface water. My recommendation would be definitely to test the water. If you don't test it, you don't know what you're starting with. Surface water is all over the map. It's crazy variable. It might be really low, but if we're dealing with the spring, there might be a lot of runoff, and it might actually be higher. So it really depends what's around that water source. If there are a lot of livestock operations with their poop, and then the rains come, that water could be highly contaminated, which would then potentially put those berries at risk. I will say, yes, the FSMA produce safety rule says you do have to do all that if the berries or if the flowers are present. The biggest risk by far is if that actual harvestable portion of the product is present. So the literature says, yes, it can go in a flower. It's much more risky if the actual strawberry is present, but I can help you more with that because I recognize that as a practice that does happen. Dan, would you like to add something?
I just wanted to ask, when you're using surface water, regardless of what you're using for Eric's example or in general, if you test it at the beginning, isn't there a potential of it changing over time? So how often should it actually be tested if you need to use it for like an entire month?
Yeah, absolutely. It's surface water. It changes every second, right? I mean, a running water changes constantly, but a pond even changes, although a lot less quickly. I would take a sample around the time of use. So it's supposed to be representative of use. So if you're using it in May, well, then test it a week before you use it. And some people I recognize say, I don't want to know. Because if I know, then I might have to do something differently. The reality is, remember, I hate to go back to, kind of the liability, but not knowing is not an answer that is acceptable in court. So I didn't want to know because I might have to make a change, doesn't stand up well. If you said, I tested, I saw what it was, and I I mean, I'm trying to think what they would do if it was extremely high and they needed it for frost protection. That's a tough one.
Fair enough. But the other question though is like, what if you need it for like June through July, when you stress your well out, so you can't get all the irrigation that you need out, and so
Yeah.
would you test at the beginning of June, the middle of June, the beginning of July, the middle of July?
I mean, you could do it as much as you wanted, but generally I would say maybe once a month is adequate in the summer. At some point, it's just so expensive and time consuming that.
Well, thank you. I'm also looking for, what they would consider reasonable is what I.
Oh, well, so I always go back to the FSMA produce safety rule is kind of the standard of the day. And it says, let's say 5 times throughout the growing season. So take that with what you will. Yep. So and that's what a gap audit would say as well. And so I would understand my initial quality, and then I would take steps after that to reduce those risks. If they could at all come up with an irrigation well, that would be better than the surface water, especially if the harvestable portion is present. If it's at the flowering stage, I will look into it more.
It's just the $11,000 to get an irrigation well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I recognize that. All the other, in a lot of other states, they treat it because they have a lot of water that they're using and a lot of product to make money on. So I recognize that it's difficult at a smaller scale for sure, but the risk is still there. So we just have to come up with cost-effective ways to reduce those risks. Okay. Should we return? Yeah, no, good question, Eric. Thank you. Thanks for the most difficult question. No, just kidding. 10:38 return, Emily.
Yep. And we'll find some music to play while you guys are doing your biofit break. We'll see you soon.
All right, on to animals. Again, we're just kind of hitting the highlights here. This is also a question in your homework. So kind of think about how animals, both wild and domestic, can impact food safety. Animals obviously do a lot of damage in our produce fields in terms of chewing, so we don't want them there. They also poop, which equals the application of raw manure. So we have pathogens in their feces that can cause illness. We actually have had some large national illness outbreaks, foodborne illness outbreaks that have been traced back to excessive wildlife in the field. To be clear, we're really worried about like a large amount of wildlife in the field. We're not necessarily talking about 1 or 2 deer that happen to walk through. So I know that in the beginning we asked this question, what kind of animal pressure do you have in your field, or like what are some ways to reduce that? But what kind of animal pressure, what kind of animals do we have in our fields? What kind of things are people seeing?
Mice and voles.
Okay, mice and voles. Oof, some of them are difficult to manage, aren't they? The littler they are, although the big ones are also difficult. We got rabbits, deer, obviously. It's crazy how diverse our state is, because some people say, I know people who say in 25 years, I've never seen a deer near my property. And some people say, if I didn't have an 8-foot deer fence, I would not have any product to sell. The deer pressure is so great. So kind of one of our take homes here is that we have to know what type of animals are in our fields, not harvest anything that has been chewed by them or pooped on, and then do our best to keep them out, knowing that we will not succeed with 100%, will we? One thing that more is our pets. So don't invite cats into the high tunnels. Don't invite dogs into the high tunnels. I know that they both can do some animal control themselves in terms of keeping wildlife away, but they need to do that from the periphery. So you can't invite them in because the dog has rolled and God knows what, has everything on its feet, and it's just too risky to have it that close. I mean, this is food that someone's going to be eating. So you have to train it to keep it out or put it on a leash, whatever you need to do. And if you have folks coming out to visit, I would strongly suggest you say, please leave your animals at home, because that animal will probably run straight to the spinach and lift its leg, and then you have to deal with it. So if there is animal in your field, and almost all of us had to deal with that in some way if we're growing outside, the idea is to use a no harvest buffer of some sort. So this bottom picture here, we've got some Swiss chard, a favorite of deer. The deer came through, had themselves a snack. Would we harvest the Swiss chard that remains there? I mean, there's really not anything left, but no, let's say there was more left. This is not an area where any law or any gap audit or any FSMA is going to tell you exactly how much distance you need between the signs of animals there and harvesting. This is just your judgment and your own risk analysis and your determination to protect your own farm. So it would not be worth the risk to harvest those little bits. Also pay attention to where there's chewing, because then right near behind it, there might be poop, because as you know, we know as deer walk that they're going to poop. So it's just keeping your eyes open for that. If you've got some strawberries there at the top, way too close to that poop to harvest. So you would just let those be. One thing people do is have a flag to identify if you have a larger amount of poop, not for every last little bit, but if you've got a larger amount of poop and something got in and really kind of did its thing, you could stick a flag in it or near it so that you didn't have to stop what you were doing, but it would just be an indicator to everyone working to steer clear. So people have used that with success. Different ways to keep.
Can I jump in with a question here? Did you say that the Swiss chard that was regrowing was safe to harvest?
I would not. No. Okay. I mean, it does become a difficulty when there's something that is going to regrow over the season, right? To me, that is so cleaned up by deer. I would not personally harvest that area anymore. But of course, everything around it is okay. What I would do if I'm seeing any more than a few bits of poop is just get it out of the field, because then you're reducing the potential for that recontamination over time, especially if that field will be in production for a while. So if you've got kale that you plan to keep on harvesting from for a long time, get the poop out of there, because the other thing is it splashes up. You've got rain. Raindrops have been shown to have like 3 feet of the ability to throw that soil up 3 feet. They have that much pressure power with them.
Could they also cover let's say there's some deer poop by their kale. Could they just like put some straw over that? Or is it best to just completely clean it up, or even just bury it right there in the field?
Yeah, if it's a smaller amount, I personally would say burying it. And again, that's really your judgment call, what you feel comfortable with as the farm, who at the end of the day will be responsible if someone did get sick. But if it's a small amount, burying it is likely okay. If it's a larger amount, I would not, because then we have to really consider that the application of raw manure and use that kind of waiting period. But if it's a smaller amount, the main thing is just use your best judgment here. It's not at all. I mean, I will say that the instances of foodborne illness outbreak traced back to wildlife are when there have been massive deer pressure and people harvested a bunch of strawberries around a bunch of deer poop, and they just didn't put 2 and 2 together, sort of a thing. So I mean, generally, if there's a small amount, we're doing our best to not harvest it, because we don't want to bring it in the pack shed. Do your best to keep animals out with things like these things that can scare off animals. You already kind of talked about some of them that work for you. Fencing is often the only thing that keeps out deer. We've got kind of this 2-level 3D fencing that can be useful if you're going to use that electrified fence. Putting tinfoil on it with some peanut butter or something to attract them can be useful, or just that really high fence. I know that the DNR program, some people have used successfully to get some money towards those fences. I know that they are not cheap. The netting would be for a high value crop to keep the birds off of, like fruit or something. These can be kind of scary. You have to change these things a lot, but like the Mylar tape really flashes and moves. The scary head might scare crows. The floppy guy needs power, but if you had it, those are effective. I've talked to a couple people that said they're extremely effective, but they're more intensive in terms of your time and labor and expense to get those going. All right, harvest, moving along, because this is just kind of a survey. So as we're harvesting, so these guys are field packing some peppers, which is just fine. To be clear, you do not have to wash everything, and they're picking directly into the box that will go to their customer. So they're definitely not putting that box on the ground, which is really important, because that box is going into someone's warehouse. And if there was soil, visible soil on that box, it very well might be rejected. So they're doing that. One thing that they're doing that isn't super great, can someone tell me? They've since stopped doing this practice. Someone see something that could maybe be improved here? Yeah, so they're wiping the produce. So they've got their peppers and they are possibly dusty. Maybe it's been dry and they want them to be shiny. And so they were wiping them. They asked their customer. They didn't ask their customer. They just did this. They then later heard their customer said, it was a wholesaler, and they said, no, we don't need you to, we would prefer that you don't wipe those. We're going to wash them. They're really not visibly dirty. There aren't a little bit if they were touching the ground, but not a concern. We wash them, please don't, because that wiping itself could be spreading the contamination. So I hope that you can start to think around a little bit of soil isn't necessarily bad. Soil isn't, it might have contamination, but it might not. So we're, if there was some poop on it, now you've spread that rag from onto every single pepper. So it probably would be best from a food safety perspective to just field pack these, use growing conditions to minimize the soil getting on them from the first place. The black plastic mulch, drip tape can help. If you're going in a tunnel, of course, that can help with the rain splash, but keeping them clean from the first place so you don't have to wash. Tomato, again, with the animals, you got a lovely tomato, you got a big sign of poop, you're not pulling that in. It's just not worth it. You can't wash that off fully. If you want to eat that, go for it. If you want to give it to your family, but you can't do that for someone else. You can't make that decision because we can't fully wash it off. If you were to drop the produce as you're growing it or in the pack shed, that also should not be put into your product that's leaving the farm for sale. It's just too risky. You don't know that it has been damaged, first of all, so it won't last as long in post-harvest. Also, it could be touching poop. So there we go. We've got some poop right next to it, and the potential for contamination is too great. So I know those are blueberries that are gorgeous, and blueberries are not easy to grow, and so it's a shame. Here we've got a hand cart kind of keeping our totes off the ground. So we really want to keep our totes off the ground so that we're not bringing excess soil into our post-harvest pack shed, whatever that might be. We're often stacking our things. So if there was soil on the bottom when we're stacking it, that soil is just going to get down and get our produce even more dirt all over it, make us have to do more washing. Also think about cross-contamination. You're bringing that tote right into the pack shed, putting it on a table. If that bottom was covered in soil, it would just be more cleaning for you. Think about the actual vehicle that you're using. I have heard of wholesalers rejecting loads for, it's not common, but if you had a visibly filthy vehicle with cat hair and a cat and some oil and garbage, and then your produce sitting amongst that, they might not accept that because it just, the risk is too great. So this is someone's food, so keep it, obviously you likely don't have a dedicated vehicle, but keeping it as cold as possible during transport. It's not required to be under refrigeration as per law or anything, but really keeping it as cool as possible after harvest, and then keeping it cool to maintain that cold chain is going to make it last longer for your customers. And then if you are using a multi-use vehicle like this, cleaning it out, making sure there's not chemicals and other kind of non-food things right next to it. I'd like it if there was a pallet there too, if that was on a pallet, if those things were on a pallet, because those truck liners can be dirty. So now we're going to talk about the washing. Go ahead and pop any questions in the chat. I want to make sure we have time for our breakout at the end too. So post-harvest water. So now we've talked about the water during the irrigation, and we've talked about hand washing and soil amendments and animals in the field and harvesting safely. And now we're going to talk about the washing. So if we were bulk washing that lettuce, there has potential to spread, that water has potential to spread any contamination that might be present around. We can't be 100% accurate. We're teaching our workers to not harvest lettuce with poop on it or kale with bird poop on it, but we might miss some. So that post-harvest water, here's some kind of best practices. First of all, you don't have to wash everything. We'll give you an example here next about some things to potentially not wash. Make sure that the water is fully potable. We're not using any surface water for this. Testing to ensure that, changing the water frequently, cleaning the actual container that you're using to wash in, because the container itself could get pretty dirty, and then using a sanitizer if possible in that wash water that's intended for use in produce wash water. So that's a food grade sanitizer. But first, as a part of your wholesale pitch, I would, as a part of that conversation, I would say, do you want this product washed? And depending on what it is, they might say no. They might say, how dirty is it? You then will have kind of an idea. They often will not want visible soil. So if you had carrots, clearly you're going to have to wash them off because they don't want a carrot caked in soil. But depending on your soil type, it might be, your carrots might actually not be dirty. Likely most root vegetables are going to have to be washed a little bit. Often people aren't washing those top categories there, the tomatoes, the berries, some of the storage items. Cabbage might be washed, but if it was going for kind of a longer storage, so I would ask them how long in between when they buy it from you and when they're going to use it. If it's meant for storage, it might not be washed because it won't hold up well in storage once it's been washed. If it is dirty, things like green beans, eggplants, peppers, cucumbers, those kind of things, if they're dirty, yes, again, if they're caked with visible soil, likely a customer will not want that to come in, and that will need a quick rinse or a dry wipe with the clean rag that you change frequently. But then the things that are often washed are the greens, just because they're grown so close to the ground, you got sand and dirt, and then the root crops. But this is going to be customer specific and your kind of soil and farm condition specific. But the takeaway is washing doesn't equal safety. You don't have to do it. We also use it for hydrocooling. I know in broccoli, for example, we get it if we're growing organically to get the worms out. So I recognize there are other reasons that we wash. But if you're thinking about it just for food safety, know that it should be a conversation between you and the customer, and kind of think before you absolutely do it. And you might take a little bit of experimentation, right? Say, I stopped washing that and it's actually doing just fine. My customers aren't balking. It's nice and clean and it's holding up great. So I'm going to stop washing it. And I work with a lot of growers who have slowly reduced the number of things that they've been washing. So if you are using that kind of bulk tank where a lot of things are kind of commingled, you can use a sanitizer. Again, this doesn't wash up that contamination, so we're still not bringing in stuff with poop on it. But if you want to, you can use something like a Sanidate 5.0. It's a peracetic acid, and it's a formulation that's intended for the wash water itself. And what it does is remove the vast majority of those organisms, those microorganisms in the water. And so it is vinegar, and it's hydrogen peroxide, and it's water, and it really breaks down in the environment. It's listed, OMRI listed for organic use, but it does a really nice job of sanitizing that water, not the product itself. Tsunami is another available. There's a lot of different sanitizers that are listed for this use. It also can improve shelf life, so those spoilage microorganisms can be reduced as well. I would prioritize it, using it in things like greens and higher risk commodities, melons, green onions, leeks, those kind of things. For winter squash and things, maybe not worth it. I would test the amount, change the water frequently, because once it gets a lot of turbidity in there, the efficacy of the product is going to be reduced. And you can tell how much is in there by using these little tester strips that you can purchase with when you buy the product. We'll actually be sending a link to that BioSafe and the name of that rep, that if you did want to get your hands on that product. That sanitizer, that 5.0, is approved for use for surfaces as well, like sanitizing your actual tools and tables and things. It's a different amount. You're going to make a weaker amount for the wash water, but you'll just follow the label for that. So this is just a 3-bin system for greens. So we've got our first tank, our second tank, and our third tank. I like this system because you can just empty that one that gets dirty at the beginning, maybe the most often. You'll see here that the gray tank there is nothing fancy. It's just a bin that's not intended for food probably, but that's what they had. So I really want to impress upon you that in post-harvest, you just do the best with what you have. You do not have to go out and spend $10,000 if you don't have that or don't want to on fancy new stainless steel equipment. As you improve, think about food safety. But right now, if you've got these bins, that's just fine. They can wash them, they can clean them well, they can apply a sanitizer, and then they can put clean water in and rinse the vegetables. They can use the spray table. The spray tables are nice for things like roots, you know, the really sturdy items that can be sprayed. They're also drying things on there. Also just a multi-use table. You can pack your boxes on there really well. They clean up really nicely. Again, the packing area is kind of whatever you have. If you have an enclosed packing area with a floor drain and some stainless equipment, it will be easier in some ways. You will have to do maybe more cleaning, but you're able to enclose it and keep the animals out. If you're packing outside, that's okay too. Think about drainage. If I was packing under this tent and I was dumping out water so frequently, I would think my first thing would be is, where am I standing? Am I standing in mud? Let's really think about drainage. Maybe putting some pallets, especially if you can get your hands on some plastic pallets. Standing on those can really be helpful, but really thinking about where that water flows to get it away from the packing area. As you are able, as you get grants or are able to invest in your equipment, thinking about sanitation kind of as you increase. So here, this is a number of years ago at this farm, but this is what they had. This is what they had money for. They had a pack line here. So someone tell me something good about this pack line and something that can be improved. It's kind of in the off season. There's some benches up there. I recognize that. I think it wasn't actually in use at this moment. Hoses are off the ground. Yep, I've got a concrete floor. Absolutely. Those are both good things. I like that the hoses are coming from the ceiling. It's not a tripping hazard. The hose ends, think about your hose ends so they're not going into a tank covered in muck from the ground. I see that. It has a roof. Yes, it's open, which is just fine. That often people pack there. So animals can definitely still get in. So if I was them, I would clean and sanitize my line before I started work, because I don't know what kind of had a nap on it overnight. I like that they're using a spray table. I like that the water goes down and then goes away. It's hard to tell, but the drainage is really good and it goes away into a gravel kind of drainage field that they built. The wood is not great, is it? So wood is a porous product that is not very easily cleaned and sanitized. It's okay because primarily it wasn't a food contact surface. So the food itself was going on the spray table, not on the wood. So really prioritize making your food contact surface cleanable and sanitizable. The thing that the actual, lettuce will be sitting on. That wood though was hard to clean and stuff got stuck under it because of the way it was built. So think about your engineering, hat and get someone who could to help you if you don't have those skills, and really think about the design of it so that it's cleanable and sanitizable, so that nooks and crannies aren't there. So the tops of carrots and your bits of beets and everything don't get stuck in there and make it really difficult. It saves you so much time too, because how much time did they spend trying to get in there and scrub that out? I like that it has a concrete floor. It's absolutely easier to wash concrete, isn't it? This is another idea of keeping hoses off the ground. It's just a simple kind of U-hook pipe there so that when you're filling a tank, the water isn't, the hose isn't flying out. Really try to avoid just kind of clutter and detritus and the things of life that build up. Those are going to attract animals. And they are just, they're going to provide some sort of shelter for the animals as well. If you have a brush washer, think about the sponges themselves, they don't dry out. So even if you don't have a brush washer, think about the materials that you use in your post-harvest environment and making sure that you can clean it and sanitize it. These sponges on a brush washer are meant to absorb water, and they literally almost never dry out. So they just get funky and funky and funky. So they're intended to be replaced every year. That doesn't always happen. And then they start looking like this. So just kind of keep an eye, use your eye in your post-harvest environment and say, okay, is it drying out and can I clean it? Here they're packing under a tent, which is really nice, but you got those tomatoes on a table, which is nice. But look at how tall those weeds are. We got probably rodents galore in there, but then they were able to upgrade, and then they have a nice gravel ground, which is going to be just a nicer place to work for everybody as they're able to invest. We've got some spray tables. This is a design that we actually made, and it's got 3 tanks on one side and then just a spray table on the other. And the sinks themselves have a lug where the water can come out, a drain. So you don't have to actually pick it up and physically dump it, which is kind of nice. That's kind of small. Some people might say, ooh, that tank is pretty small for washing. So you might have to have a bigger one, but it's kind of just a starting point. Plastic pallets I recognize as expensive, but they sure do last a long time. Yeah, Eric, those were from something like Uline, exactly. Yeah, they're not that difficult to find. And I also like the small, you can get the half pallets, so you can make those, you know, they're a little bit more flexible. And if you're in a smaller environment, you can put them in smaller places. But again, the frame is wood, which is just fine because the wood isn't really touching the produce. Is this going to last for 20 years? No, it's definitely not. But it also cost, you know, a few $100s. So it's just kind of a trade-off. But you can absolutely scrub and sanitize those and have really good food safety with these. Is there a question on that before I move? You could use the pallets as the surface on the stand for the wash table. You could, if that, yep. I mean, they're maybe pretty heavy. That bench, that greenhouse bench there on the right was really pretty affordable. It was like maybe $100 for a pretty big piece, or maybe even less. The shipping kind of got you. I think the actual product was less than that. And then that's what it's intended for. So it's not going to be so bulky and heavy, but it's nice and rigid. It was a good probably inch in depth. So it was fairly rigid. There's a lot of different ways to make spray tables. I really like the rigidity of that as opposed to a screen, because screens really do tend to kind of dip over time and they can rust depending on the materials that you use. So as you're designing your post-harvest, just think through, is my material going to hold up to a lot of weight on it and a lot of, if I'm using a sanitizer in my wash water, is that going to corrode the product? Does it have nooks and crannies, and can I clean it well? Can I get to everything? Sometimes people end up kind of repurposing a machine that wasn't intended for food, and it has lots of areas that are just difficult to get to. Sometimes even if they're using a machine that was intended for food, like a brush washer, it's still hard to get to, or a barrel washer. It can be very difficult to get in there. Unfortunately, the equipment manufacturers are just pieces of equipment. So onto the cleaning and the sanitizing. It does not need to be some big complex thing. Just basically it's similar to what you might do in your kitchen. You do have to physically clean these things sometimes. So be it totes and tables and tools or brush washers, the things that are touching the food, remember prioritizing those. We call them a zone 1. Things that actually touch the food are kind of like where your mind should be focused on, you know, the windowsills and the floor and everything could maybe have some contamination that could head on over, but it's going to be more difficult, or, you know, it's going to be less likely for sure. So first, we're going to scrub, we're going to rinse. If we've got a dirty tote, we just came in from onion harvest, gosh, that tote is dirty. We're going to spray it with water. Then we're going to use an actual scrub brush with a little bit of Dawn or another sort of detergent, rinse it again to get rid of those subs, and then use some sort of a sanitizer. Now, we don't have to do this every single time. You might have a lot of totes, so you kind of develop the schedule for how frequently this happens. A lot of times when they're really filthy, you will do this, and then a couple of times on a schedule throughout the growing season is probably probably adequate. Things like tools, I would recommend doing every day, like harvest tools. Sanitizing those will drastically reduce the amount of plant disease that can be on those as well, which can spread around your farm. So it has some kind of dual benefits there. One type of sanitizer that you could make, very inexpensive. If you're certified organic, you might not be able to use chlorine, but you put 2 to 3 teaspoons of bleach, depends on the concentration. So read the label, but let's say we're at a 6% sodium hypochlorite, we're going to put 2 to 3 teaspoons in 1 gallon of water, put that into a spray bottle, label it well, and that's your sanitizer. You can test the amount with a tester strip that you can easily get online. Make sure that you're getting a chlorine tester strip, and it should register about 150 ppm. And you will need to discard that after about a week because it will break down. So also think about contact time. Once you spray it, it does need to sit there as long as the label says. Might be 1 minute, for example. So you don't just spray it on and then wipe it off with your paper towel because it didn't do its job then. Storage, whatever kind of storage you have in your post-harvest, just keep things kind of tidy. Again, this is a worker happiness thing too. It just makes everything easier to find and saves you time in the end. Keep things up off the ground. If you've ever worked in a restaurant or a hospital, it's like, floor is lava, like let's keep it up off the ground. Our boots are on the ground, maybe we got chemical spills, we got dogs, we got all kinds of things. I think keep things up off the ground as much as you can. Have some sort of a pest control program. This is an example of just simple pallets on cinder blocks up off the ground. I bet that these different totes have different sort of designation. Maybe yellow go out, but green always stay in the pack shed, for example. That's a way to kind of cut down on your cleaning, to designate some that go out in the field and get dirty. If you're wearing rain gear and things like that, making sure that it is cleaned occasionally and have kind of a place to put it. Don't take it in the bathrooms, have some hooks outside. Taking off footwear, especially if you have livestock, don't go and do your animal chores and then go straight into the field or the pack shed. So changing boots or at least cleaning them in between use. Really think about your packaging. I've heard this from a number of wholesale buyers specifically. Some of them might require brand new packaging. So if they do, that's a cost of doing business with that customer. So when you buy that brand new packaging, it's expensive. Keep it up off the ground, keep it wrapped if possible, and then store it in a way so that if here we've got the edges pointing out so that if a mouse did run over, it's just going over 2, it's not going over all of them. But really think about that packaging storage. Don't keep it outside. If you don't have an enclosed pack shed, you have to have it somewhere. You could have it in a big tote. You could have it, in a very designated clean spot in the garage somewhere, but I would not keep it outside where animals and things can get into that. But in the pack shed, just some real quick best practice here. Keep the animals out from the first place. Try not to have them in. Don't have like your bag of seeds that's going to pull them in. If you do have mice, really putting some sort of pest control, like this bottom guy here is this tin cat. We've got a window where we can look in and we can see if he's in there. Keep a map that says kind of where your pest control is so that some lucky soul has the job of going and checking those. And B is correct there. The mouse just runs in. There's no bait in that. We're not going to use bait in the pack shed. He just runs along the edge like mice do, right into there. And they definitely work. I like the ones with the windows better as opposed to those though. So there's a map, and then just keep a map, once a week, check the traps, for example, and keep a very simple log might be an idea. Oh, nothing was found. Oh, it's this time of the year, we're seeing a lot coming in, just to have that kind of record for yourself. Okay. That is it for all of the content. I'm going to give just a couple slides on food safety plans, and then we're going to go into a quick breakout. Questions on anything I talked about? Okay, so a food safety plan really just describes your food safety policies And it also could contain some records. So some records might sound scarier than it is. I know that we recommend keeping records for a lot of things. You could add just 1 or 2 food safety records as well, primarily around cleaning and employee training and water testing would be kind of the ones that I would suggest. So the cleaning, you can see here, we've got at the top, we've got they cleaned the floor and the cooler, for example. You could just have a simple log, and we've got samples there, templates. You don't have to keep it. You don't have to start from scratch, and then you just put your initial. The plan really describes how you approach food safety. So if that buyer doesn't require a gap audit, remember, you don't have to get that then. But having this plan, maybe it's 5 pages and it just says, here's my policies. We don't work when we're sick. We test our water. We use manure, but we use it safely. We apply it in the fall, work it in well, put on cover crops, really do our best to reduce any risks there. You're like proactively describing that you have good food safety. It is required for a gap audit. It's not required for the FSMA food safety rule, but certainly it is a good idea for that as well. So it is your practices that you're doing. Now in your homework, you're going to be asked how you approach some things. You might not have an idea about how you approach those things at this point. You still talk about what you're doing right now. If it's a goal for the future, just clearly say, okay, I don't have any hand washing right now, but next year I plan to have 2 on the farm, and this is where they'll be. Recognize that when you actually have a final food safety plan, you wouldn't have a plan for the future. You'd have it describing what you do right now. But at this point, you might have to describe what you're doing or what your goal is. Okay, that's it. So now we will get into breakout rooms. How do we want to share the homework template, Emily?
If you want, I mean, I can just pull up like the wholesale readiness folder and sort of show people where to find that. I mean, it's really just the same as like in any other course session that we have. We'll have the folder that's set up for a group. There will be a section that says, homework, and then there will be a link in there for you to submit. But I can share that really fast if that's helpful for folks. That will be session 4. Maybe I'll go out of it like this. Okay. All right, so you should be looking at a Google folder. This is where you've got all of your content normally. So we would just go into the session 4 section. And then this is the one that I believe you're referring to, Annalisa, correct? Yeah, okay. So then what you'll do is you can right click on it and then you could make a copy that way. That's a really fast way to do it. If you go into the document itself, it's going to be view only from your end. And then you'll just click on the file button. You can download as a Word document, or you can make a copy that way as well. And that'll save to your own Google Drive. And then from there, you'll be able to just make edits on your own. And then when you're ready to submit, you'll go to the homework submission piece, you'll go to the link. This will take you where you need to go. So then you'll copy that, put that into a new tab, and then you'll just put in your name, and then you'll add the file, and then we'll have it ready to review. So I think that's all you need on TechStep. Any questions on that front?
And the PowerPoint is in there for you as well if you need to be reminded of some of the concepts. But
yeah, we've got PowerPoint there. We've also got some resources that Annalisa put together for you guys. And we'll make sure that we've got the chat too as well for folks, because oftentimes we've got resources or interesting questions that people want to know. So these will all be available for you.
Okay. Does anyone want to share anything that came out of those discussions? Ryan, Natalie?
I guess one conversation we had was one of the people in our group. You can unmute and share if you want to share this yourself, but this person at the beginning of the day was talking about like, I'm not quite ready yet to start reaching out to people. Like that's kind of a next year goal, but some of these things are really long-term planning. Like if if the school you're selling to wants a gap audit, like that's maybe something to think about for this summer to prepare you for next summer. So just some of the dynamics of like, when do you have those conversations? Although Annalisa, can you speak to that? Like how often are schools asking for gap audits? Ever?
Not often. Oh, yeah, some, especially if they were run by like a food food service management company, they might be more likely. But if they're self-operated, no, I don't think it's common. That's not to say it's never going to happen, but likely, no, your food safety plan is going to be plenty, hopefully. And if you, to be clear, if you are getting questions back from a school, I would absolutely approach them this year. Yeah, don't hesitate based on anything you heard today. If they then say, I think you need a gap audit, I'm pretty sure that's the law. That some might think that. You now are armed with the information to say, no, that's not a law. I have great food safety and I have a plan to document it. Will you take this? They might then say, well, I don't care if it's a law, it's still our rule. And they can say that. But most schools are not going to be asking for that audit.
Annalisa, I'm sorry, this is not on topic, but you mentioned the exemptions, the exclusions, and the covered under FSMA, and under the exempt, the over 50% to qualified end users. You said restaurants are included in that?
They are, yeah. Restaurants and grocery stores, as long as they're within the same state, Indian reservation, or within 275 miles, are considered an end user.
Okay. And wholesale is just like to a food hub?
Anybody who's buying it and moving it, reselling it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We just had a little theme about getting organized, creating a kind of straightforward, simple system that works, right? So it's a lot of kind of casual, I don't know, maybe we're rinky-dink how we're set up in terms of like, making a nice, clean, simple system, whether even if it's outside or if it's inside in a cement floor facility, great. But either way, they still need a system.
I wonder if there's like a Pinterest page that has like all of these different images of like setups that people have as inspiration. I feel like that could be really cool.
There are many, many such places. Yes, I could include many more, not on Pinterest, but in other parts of the country, they have a lot of capacity around food safety. I will say lots of educators who work with small farms to help them at the beginning of their journey as they're building, to say, this is ideas for engineering a pack shed with food safety in mind. So University of Vermont, for example, has excellent like pack shed resource layout, how to think about the design of your equipment and what it's made out of. So I will include those. Gina says, love to include. Yeah, because a lot of us are just if you're just starting out, this is the perfect time to think about where should that hand washing sink go? Oh, it turns out it shouldn't go on the clear other side of the pack shed from the door so that I have to walk through the darn thing. It's just like right when I get in. How wide should that drain be?
One really great resource, this is not food safety, but in thinking about the design, is just like the Lean Farm book and the examples that they have, just for like that kind of thing. Like, are you going to have to be walking across the pack shed to wash your hands?
Yes.
Like really simple, efficient systems.
Lots of crossover with Lean Farm and efficiency for sure. Yeah, the goal here is not to add more stuff. I know the cleaning step is more stuff, but you can hopefully streamline it so it becomes part of the operation, isn't this massive undertaking separate from what you're doing.
The theme in my group was dealing with animals, especially dogs and cats, but then also birds flying overhead, and folks thought that the birds were not necessarily damaging a lot of produce, like maybe 1% of produce was showing signs of bird droppings, and maybe that's worth it to keep the birds around that they want around for aesthetics or for insect control. So, but dogs and cats was the first thing out of the mouths of a couple of people, and how hard it is to keep them out of the veggie areas. Because they don't listen.
They don't always. Yep, I have. Yeah, many people say they work long and hard to train the dogs. Yep. And yeah, if it's not a risk, it's not a risk. If the poop isn't on the veggie, remember, it's not a risk. So if they're just around, it doesn't matter. And absolutely having, growing in a robust ecosystem with lots of animals around is going to likely be beneficial in that it'll keep the prey animal, population in check. So yeah, if the poop isn't on, no problem. Yep, so we got that mini grant. The mini grant is due in a few weeks, and it is up to $800. There's no cost share requirement. That's through the Department of Agriculture. It is competitive, and many people will be turned down. I just want to get that out there from the beginning. If you have attended a GAP training or a FSMA training, you get extra points towards that.
And we did already have someone let me know that they applied. So go for it, folks. The worst thing that happens is you get turned down.
It's a pretty short application, hopefully. So yeah, hopefully. And the other thing is, think about that they're doing this in the long term. This is kind of a pilot scale. They want to see the interest, and then they'll make a case to the legislature to say people need this money for supplies. I'm also remembering that I didn't really include supplies, so I will link to some supplies like the materials for the spray table, and also like the blue tanks for the hand washing stand, for example. But if there's other specific supplies, let me know.
Thank you, Annalisa. So I think we've got Jane is going to be talking about licensing in a couple of weeks. We'll make sure to get all of this content out to you, plus some of those additional resources that Annalisa is going to pull together. We just want to say thank you again for your time and your participation, engagement, and conversation. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you got a lot out of it. And with that, we will send you on your way on this lovely Tuesday. Enjoy the rest of your week, everyone, and we'll be seeing you soon.